Welcome everybody to the special Toronto Regional Board of Trade edition of the Herle Burly, and my special guest, Jean-François Perrault. Mr. Perrault is a person of, he's currently the Chief Economist for Scotiabank. Deep public policy background, which we're going to rely on a bit. Mr. Perrault has worked in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bank of Canada, the Department of Finance, before coming to Scotiabank. And we're going to have a riveting conversation about productivity with you today. In my experience, nothing lights up a room like this topic. The only thing we could have done to make it better would be PowerPoint. Let me start off though with just a little bit with that public policy background that you had. What did you like about working in the public sector?
Well, pretty simple. It's how you affect people's lives. Right. You're in public policy. Depending where you are exactly, but ultimately it's about working for the good of the economy and improving people's lives for the better. To the extent that policymakers in the public service have an influence over outcomes, which I think they do in some cases, but that's it.
Okay. Tell us something about the Department of Finance that the business community doesn't know but should.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, see, it's a tough one because the roles and responsibilities, or the effectiveness of the Department of Finance changes over time, depending on the government that's in power, depending on how much attention is paid to what bureaucrats think about issues. I'd say probably the most challenging part of it is trying to get the political folks to understand the economics or the rationale behind a particular recommendation, right? That's a job of public servants, loyal implementation, faithful, something advice. And political instincts don't necessarily gravitate to outcomes which are what you would recommend as a policy specialist in whatever field. So just kind of navigating that is, I think, the biggest challenge.
When I got the opportunity to work with that department in the 1990s, early 2000s, I thought they were some of the smartest people I've worked with in my professional life. I don't think they have to take a backseat to anybody in the business community in terms of intellect. And they understand economics. Do they understand business?
Less so, right? I mean, the reality, again, in the public service, and it's true across the country, it's not just a federal issue, is, most folks will have started their career early in public service and kind of evolved in that space. It's one of the things that I've actually found the most interesting about coming to the private sector is the perspective it gives you on things, which is very different than the perspective you get when you're thinking about a policy, looking at data, looking at economic analyses, empirical studies, laws, history, where the pedal hits the metal, or the tires hit the road, it's a little bit of the world doesn't work quite as you think it does when you're designing policy.
Right.
So getting that insight, I think, is from my perspective, been really helpful in terms of, I think, what I can infer about the economy, where things are going relative to what folks are able to do when you've been doing this entire life sitting in, Ottawa or Toronto or Victoria, or wherever you might be.
I have the impression that there's less dialogue between government and business than there used to be, less understanding of each other than there used to be.
I don't know. It's probably the case. I mean, we have at the federal level a government that is, pretty determined in achieving some of the things that it's set out to achieve as of 2015. And they've kind of been a one-track mind on that, and I think that to some extent limits the bit of the dialogue that would have occurred naturally had the agenda been a little bit more open-minded, more focused on, tangibly in productivity, for instance, and finding ways around that. So you're probably right to some extent.
Right. You've opened the door to something.
Oh.
You were in the Department of Finance for 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
You were the chief budget maker.
For a while, yep.
In the department. And you left shortly after Mr. Trudeau was elected and before Mr. Morneau delivered his first budget. Is there a backstory there that's worth hearing?
No. The backstory is a headhunter called, and I took the call. So there wasn't any.
There was nothing about the way things were going that you were uncomfortable with?
No. In fact, it was kind of interesting early on in the Morneau days because he was more of an activist, a new finance minister rolling out an agenda. There was an interesting kind of a policy lens to that. My perspective, it was just, something comes along and it's kind of interesting. And I've done that a bunch of times in my career, so I'll shift when I think something is interesting coming along the way. And it just happens to be that it happened early in the mandate.
Okay. All right. Well, let's sing for our supper. The Toronto Regional Board of Trade has brought us here to talk about productivity. So we'll have to stop just bantering now and get down to work. Productivity is something I think that most people in the country find either boring or threatening as a topic. And when I was working with the Department of Finance, I used to tell them that when ordinary people hear government or business talk about productivity, they hear that they're supposed to be working harder for less. And it's not a popular topic. But that's not the real definition of it, is it? How would you define productivity?
At the simplest level, productivity is how much you produce per worker, right? So and how that occurs is, it's a little bit of a kind of a magical thing, secret sauce. You just put capital and labor together, they produce stuff, and that is the secret to economic success at some point. It's actually the determinant of our standard of living, right? If your productivity is suffering at the expense of your competitors, there's no way you can hope to raise your standard of living as a country. Now, historically, you're right. People think productivity and they think, okay, layoffs and, we're going to do things more effectively. And, there's an element of truth to that, I guess, perhaps historically. But it's a much more complicated, much more interesting issue than I think you can simplify it as, you need less workers to do more things.
Right. But it really is, to zero in on this, really core to the standard of living question, right? Because
you can't get away from it.
You cannot. So we have in this country a mindset and a culture that expects a continuing increase in our standard of living. In fact, the mindset of this culture has always been that every generation will have a better life than the generation that preceded it. Plus, we have increasingly huge demands on our public sector, whether it's in the area of climate and energy or whether it's in the area of social issues that people want addressed. A lot of people are clamoring. None of this is possible without productivity gains. Is that correct?
Of course. 100%. Productivity is at the foundation of how an economy works. If you can't put capital and labor together well, you're not going to do well as an economy. And whether that's because you're trying to achieve a transition to something, whether it's you trying to engineer, a better life for your kids than you experienced, none of that is possible if you aren't able to compete on a global stage, if you aren't able to generate the productivity gains that, behooves, our generation in the sense that, can we make things better for people? And you can only achieve that through productivity. Now, how you kind of split that out, do the gains from productivity go to low-income folks, higher-income folks? There's some public policy issues around that. But at the end of the day, the only way to grow the pie on a sustainable basis is by raising productivity.
Right. Okay, so when we talk about raising productivity, it feels to me, from my limited understanding, that there are two basic challenges. One of which is that Canadian productivity, along with all of our G7 colleagues apparently, lagged the United States considerably in productivity. So there's a gap there that could be filled. But once that's filled, the other challenge is that productivity across the world is pretty much flat now and projected to be flat into the foreseeable future, right? Certainly the entire Western world, Japan, now even China, though, part of that thing. So let's divide that up first. My understanding is that Canadian productivity is about 60% of American productivity. That's a huge gap. What could possibly explain that?
Well, honestly, if we knew the answer to that, then we wouldn't have a productivity problem. But there are elements of an answer there that are pretty compelling. And it links, comes back to how do we associate capital with people. So if you look at Canadian productivity growth, obviously it's disappointing. Productivity levels now are where they were from 2016, so like we've backtracked in the last couple of years. But when you look at our economic performance relative to other countries, the one thing that stands out, apart from the productivity dimension, is Canadian businesses invest far less than businesses typically in the OECD.
Right.
So, if you're not growing the capital stock and you're growing the people stock, then you almost certainly generates a decline in productivity.
And what's the working hypothesis as to why Canadian businesses invest less?
So this is the big question. Nobody, although you ask these questions on the survey, everybody's got a bit different perspective on that, but it really is a mystery, right? Is it because, government policy holds back investment? Is it because businesses are more conservative? Is it because we don't have the right sources of capital to finance kind of riskier stuff? It honestly, and this is an empirical view, like it is a bit of a mystery. And if we understood that, then we'd have better solutions. We've known that investment in Canada has been weak for like 20 years. Like that's not a new thing. Governments have been trying for 20 years to do something about that, and it's, with very little success.
A former senior colleague at the Department of Finance told me that he was mystified by it because he felt that the government had done almost everything it could through the tax system to try to encourage business investment.
Well, this is the frustration, right? So there is, I think from the government's perspective, there's a legitimate argument that they can make that, they've kind of brought the horse to the water. And the horse being business investment, businesses, and they're hesitant to drink.
Yeah.
So, it begs the question of, well, if governments have tried a whole range of things, and of course they haven't tried everything and there's other stuff they can try, what else can governments do to encourage businesses to spend more?
Right. Well, would you say that overall we have a public policy environment that is supportive of innovation and productivity in Canada? If somebody was elected and said, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to focus on is this productivity gap, what would they do differently in policy terms?
I think first they'd have to be realistic about our level of understanding. Again, it's easy to say, well, we can tweak this program, add subsidies, do the shred, do various things, with a reasonable expectation that it would work, and we know historically it doesn't work. So you gotta think outside the box. This government, Minister Freeland has indicated a bunch of times, she's kind of obsessed with productivity. We're not really seeing much in the policy space that would kind of, confirm that they're active in that space. I think one of the issues is probably linked to the availability of finance, right? So if you kind of strip away we've got enough people here, that's a great thing. It's not clear that the tax system is a disincentive, although every business person say, well, you lower my tax, I'm going to invest more. The empirical reality, that's not the case when you look at international evidence. So maybe there's something to, especially when comparing to the US, where the availability of finance for firms is dramatically higher than what it is here. And that's in part a function of the system that we have here, right? We've got
Or protected banking sector?
Well,
sorry, I actually didn't mean that as a shot.
No.
I didn't mean that as a shot. It's a legitimate question because I have always seen our banking sector as a source of pride and its stability. Now it's funded. But recently somebody gave me the first counter argument I've ever heard, which is that it's much more conservative when it comes to lending to startups or speculative ventures, and there's just a lot more capital available to risky propositions in the United States than there is in Canada.
100% the case. And that's getting worse, right? We're going through a period now where the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has been tightening capital requirements for Canadian banks. They're telling banks, effectively, you got to de-risk more. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Right, and we've been kind of at the we kind of sailed through the last financial crisis, not much of an issue because we were very conservative from a regulatory perspective on how banks were managed and the types of risks that they undertook. And that probably comes at some economic cost in the productivity space because it means that, a key channel through which finance is available to firms, the banking system, has got to be more conservative because that's the rules in which we operate.
Right.
And that's getting worse, right? So as you think about, okay, well, is it going to be better in a couple of years? Are banks going to be able to take on more risk? that's not the path the regulator's putting us on right now. So you can forget about that for the next year or two, and maybe that changes in 5 years. So you really start to have to think about, okay, how do we foster greater risk appetite on the part of kind of investment capital in the country? Do we have enough investment capital in the country? And there, that's a tricky thing. If you think about, you talked about the transition a little bit, but if you think about, say, the capital requirements of our country next 10 years. Well, we know we're massively underfunding the transition stuff, right? Trillions of dollars of investment needed there. We've got, if you believe CMHC, like a shortage of 4 or 5 million homes. Record population growth. You got to invest in that. You got to invest in hospitals. You got to invest in a whole bunch of stuff that comes with that. So there is clearly going forward a need for a lot more capital in the system that banks are probably not going to be able to provide to the extent that's required. What do you do about that? Well, if you find a way to unlock capital, if you can find a way to inject a whole lot of money in the economy from the private sector, forcing people to take more risks. I'll give you like a simple example, and this is going to piss some people off probably, but
Good.
Think of the Canadian pension system, where their share of domestic investments has been falling through time. Maximize returns, low interest rate environment, let's buy some roads in Brazil, here and there, all over the place. So as a result of that, you've had a very significant decline in the share of, effectively, Canadian savings that are invested in Canada. That's good for pension returns, it's good for pensioners, but it probably means that as a result of that, there's less capital for riskier things here. It's more difficult for firms to obtain financing because Canadian savings are going overseas.
Right.
So do you want to think about a world where maybe what you do is you mandate a minimum threshold of Canadian investment in pension plans? Like that's, of course, revolutionary. But if you were to do that, you're adding massive amounts of potential financing to the Canadian economy. And maybe that's the solution. Like maybe that helps.
You mean the half we have left after Alberta's done with us?
Or zero. I mean, apparently we owe them more than what's in there. But that, it's if you're in an environment where there's a greater availability of capital, by definition, people are going to take more chances. They're going to be willing to fund enterprises that are, at the riskier end of things.
Right.
A lot of those are going to fail, but you can't be innovative, you can't create, you can't grow if you don't have an environment where you foster failure, because out of that comes fantastic ideas and fantastic developments.
Right. Well, that has to be private sector, because government ventures can't fail.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
only private sector ventures can fail and
Sure.
be considered to be successful. So, a few weeks ago, I was on here talking about our presenting sponsor TELUS's efforts to respond to specific extreme weather events and wildfires this summer. These were post-disaster relief efforts, critical in getting communities back up on their feet. But there's a whole disaster investment element to this as well, Herle Burly-ites. Seems surreal for any company or government's budget to have a significant line item called disaster funding, but here we are. We know that climate change brings extreme weather events and natural disasters. That, in turn, makes it necessary for our telecommunications industry to invest massively in their network infrastructure, so service is as close to uninterrupted as possible. The objective is always no downtime. But extreme weather puts that objective through an extreme test. Let's face it, you can't effectively fight a wildfire without a network, eh? First responders, community members, governments, and emergency services, they all need to be connected to coordinate a safe and successful operation. Back to the dollars and cents of it all. So many of these facilities and disaster sites are remote. Think, in the middle of forests and heavy brush. So when local power is compromised, generators and fuel often need to be helicoptered in to keep cell towers operational. TELUS, for their part, has worked hard to fortify operations by being proactive about it, adding generators and solar panels to its cell tower sites, proactively brush clearing to prevent fire damage, building in resilient infrastructure and redundancy at every level. I hardly have to tell you, it ain't cheap to build and maintain these networks. And then, even with all the pre-planning, sometimes disaster strikes and the investment takes a major hit. Capital is needed to rebuild in those cases too. But TELUS wants you to know the objective is still the objective. No interruptions, no downtime. They'll continue to work in partnership with local municipalities and provincial governments to make sure this critical infrastructure is ready when everybody needs it most. So, a couple of things that I think about from a public policy perspective. What is the impact of the climate agenda and energy transition on this productivity question for Canada? Is it a source of productivity gains because we're getting involved in all sorts of new technologies? Or is it true that basically the oil sands were one of our most productive enterprises and we're in the process of curtailing it?
So if you look at the history of investment in Canada over the last 20 years, the times where investment was less of an outlier from a national perspective is when there was activity in the oil sands, right? When we were investing in that space. So you take that off because of the transition, then of course you get a decline in investment that's pretty meaningful. I actually think, so the solution to the energy transition is not there yet, right? We know we want to transition. We know there's a whole bunch of capital needs to be deployed. We know they're going to be a need for new technology, innovation that is substantial to achieve those objectives.
Right.
Now, by definition, we don't know what those technologies are going to be because they haven't been invented yet. But I kind of see the transition and the amount of funding and the policy direction and kind of the force that's being applied to the economy to make that happen as a really interesting opportunity to increase productivity a lot, right?
Okay.
Because you're throwing, in principle, throwing a ton of money in a field where you have no choice but to innovate and create. Because the stuff doesn't exist.
Okay.
Or it doesn't exist at scale.
Does this even apply to mining, like critical minerals and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, if you think of the bigger picture, folks think about the green transition as a risk to Canada because we, do a lot of oil and gas. I actually think of it as an incredible opportunity because not only are we going to keep producing oil and gas for quite a while, but we are in the potentially in the critical mineral space, able to capitalize on friendshoring, worries about where you get your stuff in an environment where the demand for the minerals is going to rise stratospherically. The OECD estimated, 4 or 5 months ago or 6 months ago, that there would be a tripling in copper demand between now, I think, in 2040 to achieve our environmental objectives. There'd be a 40 times increase in demand for graphite, like a 20 plus times increase in demand for lithium. Like the list goes on. So you're talking about a game-changing environment in the mineral space.
Right.
So if you capitalize on that, in addition to all the investments that we need to do to kind of innovate in that space, there is potential to be really optimistic about where we're headed. You just have to, set it up so you can pull stuff out of the ground and succeed in the kind of the technological race. And that's not a guarantee, of course, because we're not really good at that.
So just before he started hiking rates, Tiff Macklem gave a speech, I think here in Toronto, in which he said, I'm going to have to start hiking rates, right? He said, my business survey tells me that businesses are intending to invest a lot this year in equipment and other things like that. He said, I'm going to be raising rates, but I need you to still make those investments. What is the impact of high interest rate, not high, I don't want to call them high because we've lived through high interest rates, but higher interest rates on the business investment?
So, I mean, it needs to be a negative impact, right? So you got to think about what the governor's been trying to achieve. He's got an inflation problem. The only way, one of the ways, the main way you can contain an inflation issue in a domestic world is you got to slow growth. So he's raising interest rates to slow growth. You can't raise interest rates and hope investment accelerates, right? The intent is he wants it to hurt.
Wouldn't he want business investment to accelerate?
Well, of course.
Consumption
sure.
to stop,
well, ideally.
Of
course, ideally. But, if consumption is slowing down and the cost of financing is going up, it's kind of rich to expect businesses to keep investing, right?
Okay.
And on top of that, you've got this really unique dynamic in Canada, which I'm convinced has got something to do with the productivity issues that we're dealing with now, is, by virtue of the incredibly powerful immigration programs that we have, and I'm a huge supporter of those. What we've effectively done for the last number of years is we've made it easier for businesses to hire folks from international, which is fine. And that's probably coming at the expense of providing them incentives to invest, right? So you're changing the relative cost of capital and labor. You're making it easier. You're telling businesses, listen, have your fill of workers. And if you can invest, fantastic. Other countries have gone the other way. The Americans have gone the other way. It's like they're not increasing immigration, but they're helping their businesses invest a lot. So you're seeing a different mix. And that's not something the governor could have anticipated either. Like the explosion of populations has just been historic by any stretch of the imagination. But to your point, I mean, rates are supposed to hurt. And that means, in reality, a decline in investment. It means a decline in employment. He wants firms to lay people off. You can't expect firms to lay people off and then increase investment at the same time.
Can we just take a sidebar on this immigration question? Because I just want to demystify something about it, which is, I mean, we're constantly told that immigration is good for our economy, it brings growth to our economy, et cetera. But it doesn't solve this problem, does it? It doesn't solve what we're talking about, the productivity question, because it doesn't address GDP per capita. So when we bring in immigrants, we raise our overall GDP, but not our GDP per person. So it doesn't affect individual standards of living. Have I got that right?
It's a little bit more complicated than that.
No doubt.
At a very high level, you're right? Like if population is rising more rapidly than GDP per capita falls. But what's going on kind of beneath the cover is immigrants are coming in and typically earn less and are less productive than folks that are already in the country as they kind of climb up the skills side of the equation. So what's probably happening is for folks that are already here, their incomes are rising, and we know incomes are rising. Like wages are rising 4-5% a year. But you're diluting that. You kind of have high productivity folks with folks that are a little bit less productive because they're new to the country, and that distorts the GDP per capita picture.
Right. Okay. So can we zero in on? Well, before we do Toronto, because I want to get to Toronto and whether there's something unique about Toronto, are there sectors of the economy that lend themselves more to productivity gains than others? Are there some places where we should really be looking to drive this for us?
So there are surprising things in the productivity data. So you've got productivity data by industry, and no industry is doing really, really well, but there's some industries doing very poorly. And one of the things which is germane to the Toronto issue and to the housing issue is productivity in the construction sector, which is at the lowest level it's been in since 2009 actually, so like 13 years.
So what does that even mean? How does it go backwards?
Well, it means that each worker is able to produce less in an hour or in a year than they used to.
But why? How would that have happened?
Delays, permitting stuff, sitting idle for a couple of days because you're waiting for an inspector to come by. Right. We know there's technological improvement. We know firms are being innovative. We know, they're pre-building stuff. There's all kinds of stuff to manage that. But despite all these investments in an industry where there is actually scope for a lot of innovation to produce things more rapidly and effectively, despite all that stuff, the costs of the challenges of maintaining a building process are such that you're actually seeing a decline in productivity on the construction side. So that to me is like a no-brainer. Like if you can't, in addition to the fact that we need clearly way more construction of all kinds, that seems to be a pretty easy area to fix. And then of course anything related to the tech sector and kind of these high growth industries likely associated with the transition at some point or another are again no-brainers, because if you don't manage to be competitive in that space, like the energy, like the economy of the future stuff, you're just not going to be competitive. Like to some extent, it doesn't really matter if we're more competitive at producing homes here relative to the US or Europe. That's good for us, but it's not, it doesn't make us necessarily more competitive with the rest of the world. You've got to be able to compete in those international markets, and that's the cutting edge, high tech stuff on the manufacturing side. Okay,
so nobody in this room makes, builds, or does anything, right? All that happens out.
I certainly don't.
All that happens out in the real world where people work for a living. But this is probably a room with a lot of finance in it, right? A lot of money in it. What's the role of finance in the financial sector in Canada's productivity?
Really simply, we have to finance risk. We have to be of a mindset.
So if the banks aren't going to do that, are there alternative ways? Like, do we have a vibrant?
We have a vibrant venture capital.
Venture, that's the word I was grappling for.
Industry. There is, and there's a lot of private equity. There are non-bank financial institutions that lend. So there is a pretty big source of non-bank finance out there. The question very much is is there enough capital to do everything that we need to be done? And that's not the case.
No.
Right? So it's not that we don't have enough private equity for there simply is a consistent drain of our savings to other parts of the world, and that comes at the expense of, what we might be in this able to invest in, because we just we just don't have access to that financing to then lend or invest in companies that deserve it.
Right. Next week, you may have heard, is National Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada. You'll be hearing a lot in the days ahead about the state of Canada's relationship with Indigenous people and the many goals that remain. You'll also see a lot of orange shirts. You might even want to wear one yourself on September 30th. It's an opportunity to reflect on our history and the tragic legacy of government and church-run residential schools that shattered so many Indigenous homes. It's also an opportunity to reflect on how we build a better future. Our sponsor, CN, has committed to undertake that journey. For the largest railway in Canada, it is a significant commitment. Its railway runs through or in proximity of nearly 220 reserve lands of nearly 130 First Nation and Métis territories in 8 provinces. CN recognizes the importance of ensuring its trains operate safely and sustainably, as well as the mutual benefits of partnering with Indigenous communities along its network. In addition to an employee resource group, ERG, that offers a safe space for Indigenous and non-Indigenous employees to share, learn, and grow together around the unique recognitions, relationships, and histories that Indigenous peoples hold, CN has a strong, diverse Indigenous relations team that engages and builds relationships with Indigenous communities every day. The Indigenous Relations Team and the Indigenous ERG participate in events, hold discussions, and support Indigenous-led programs related to education, employment, procurement, and cultural learning. In other words, CN is trying hard to do its part. It's all any of us can do.
To me, that's in the finance world, that's the biggest challenge. Can we find ways of getting more money into the system or keeping more money in the system?
Okay. Do you have any public policy suggestions, either for Mayor Chow or for the Premier, or he's probably looking for a good idea right now, or the Prime Minister?
I think the biggest challenge as I see it, setting aside the productivity issue, which is tangential to some extent, is we're making historic investments in our population. And that's how I think about immigration. It's revolutionary, the historic investments in our ability to attract workers and to grow workers. And that's fabulous. But we are not making historic investments in the stuff that people need to work to capitalize on that. So if you want to think of a huge public policy issue is, and unfortunately this is kind of a bigger government kind of thing. If you want to capitalize on the workers that we're bringing in, if you want to make it work, you need to think about investing a lot more. Housing we talked about, but the provision of public services, education, infrastructure, you name it. So you kind of need a historic reset of that landscape. I mean, think of it in really simple terms in Ontario. So we've had about 500,000 people come in last year, probably going to do that or more this year. And just look at the hospital sector just on its own, because it's kind of easy to do.
That's just at the actual immigration system.
Yeah.
That's not the temporary foreign workers program.
No,
and that's not the students. We're talking about 1.5 million people a year.
Huge numbers of folks.
Yeah.
We have in Ontario about 2.5 hospital beds per 1,000 people. And I don't think anybody would say we've got the best medical system in the country, right? Well, you bring in 500,000 people, that's 1,200 extra hospital beds you need to build a year. And of course, we're not doing that. But it requires, that's the kind of thinking it requires, right? You're saying, okay, we're expanding our population tremendously. What other kinds of things do I need to spend on to make sure that not only is the quality of services that people are receiving now remain constant or improve, but you got to incorporate these other people as well. I mean, 500,000, like it's a big
Well, this
city,
is the most
right?
inexplicable thing I've actually encountered in the last little while, is learning that there's no coordination around this.
It's incredible.
I just assumed that all the levels of government sat down and said, okay, we're going to let in this number of people. So what are where are they going to go, and what are the resources that are going to be required to support them and integrate them and all that kind of stuff? I didn't realize the feds just stood up and announced a number, and everybody else scrambled to try to accommodate. That doesn't make any sense. Right?
It doesn't. I think we're surprised by the speed at which immigration is coming in. I mean, we're catching up. There's massive delays. We're catching up to that. So the fact that we're bringing in like 1 million or more people a year now is not. It's because it's kind of pent up people in the system. But still, like, it's inconceivable to me that you go through a process, you say, listen, we're fundamentally going to change the growth trajectory of our economy by adding people to it.
Look, if
like this was decided like
come in
almost 10 years ago, right?
250 are coming to Toronto.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, roughly. And so it's inconceivable to me that you would plan to increase your population dramatically and not think about what you're going to need as a country to make that happen.
Right.
Now, whatever. Obviously, the feds decide immigration levels, and then people decide where they want to go, and a lot of them end up here. And if there isn't kind of an increase in financial resources that's commensurate with the surge in population that you're getting, and whether that's an increase in financial resources that come from the city or the province or the federal government, it's not quite the same, but there has to be this understanding that to do this right, you've got to be willing to spend a lot more money. And that probably means higher taxes in the short run. Like, at some point, as folks are assimilated and the economy is, fully reflecting the productivity gains that come with having more people.
I don't think that's fully consistent with the Toronto Regional Board of Trade's agenda, by the way.
but this is what I mean, right? Like, because we're on this path of higher population growth, like, folks need to think about what do we actually need to do to capitalize on that.
Right.
And you're basically adding people in a system that's already strained in some way in terms of what it's able to deliver for folks from a public service perspective. You probably need to ramp up the provision of public services in a significant way, which of course nobody wants to pay more taxes, nobody wants higher property taxes, nobody wants any of that stuff. But that's just kind of a logical extension of, you want to make this work, you have to pay for it.
Well, there's
historic investment in population, you got to do historic investment in the stuff that people need.
Okay, so let's switch now to the big topic, which is why productivity's ground to a halt around the world. Mm-hmm. And your economist friends say that that's going to be the case as far as the eye can see, flat productivity growth. One economist I pay particular attention to, I've mentioned him to you before, is Peter Nicholson, one of your predecessors as the chief economist at the Bank of Nova Scotia. He said this to me. He said, the origins of productivity stagnation are deeply structural. Weakening productivity growth appears due to the gradual exhaustion of the great wave of innovations that powered the second industrial revolution: electricity, telecommunications, industrial chemistry, the internal combustion engine, and latterly the automation of many business processes. So that's his diagnosis. Mm-hmm. If that's true, what the hell do you do about that?
Well, it might be true now. I don't think it's true in the future. The reality is, again, just coming back to the Canadian example, but it bleeds into the global system. The investments that are being made now in anticipation of or to facilitate the transition are remarkable from a historical perspective. Again, internationally, look at the Americans. The American manufacturing construction is up like 80% year over year, right? So they're retooling fast in anticipation of to capitalize on this green transition. So I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's going to occur in that space. And that is almost certainly going to lead to higher productivity somehow. And then probably even more disruptive or better than that, depending on your perspective on these things, is of course artificial intelligence and how that affects how we live our lives and how we run businesses. It will unquestionably be transformational. There's no question about it. And probably in a way that supports very significant productivity growth depending on how it's rolled out. So I'm not nearly as pessimistic as some of these folks who look at previous history and say, listen, we've done all the big things. What else could we possibly hope to achieve? I think actually we're at the edge of a really interesting time from a productivity perspective, which kind of amps up the stakes from a Canadian perspective, because if other countries are able to ride these waves and benefit and grow and take advantage of all this stuff and raise their productivity, and we can't manage that, like we are screwed.
You anticipating a rapid take-up of an integration of AI?
I think it's going to be spectacularly fast. It's the kind of technology that once you roll it out, and again, like it's nascent. You don't really know how things are going to change because it's so dynamic.
Right.
But competitive pressures being what they are, if one company rolls with it and then is doing great in one sector, everybody else is going to have to catch up really, really fast. So, yeah, I think it's transformational in reasonably short order.
Right. Well, what have we got here? Global trade.
Yeah.
Global trade. When you're anticipating what's going to happen, what are you thinking is going to happen with global trade? Is it going to be more protectionism than we've seen and the de-globalization as people were talking about 2 or 3 years ago? Yeah. I've sensed some attempts to put that back into the box by some of the people that were talking about it. I don't know. So do you see continued pretty much liberalized trade, or do you see a growing trend toward protectionism?
100% growing trend towards protectionism. There's no question. And that's coming out of the U.S. And if it's coming out of the U.S., it's going to affect everybody. And we're seeing that already, right? We see, coming out of the Trump years, which of course was an increase in protectionism, the Democrats are more protectionist than, actually, the Republicans.
That's historically
maybe
true,
not anymore,
but not Trump necessarily. Right.
You're seeing, the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., which is not about inflation reduction. It's about kind of transforming their economy. It's basically in America first. We're going to invest a whole lot of money in our economy to make us more self-sufficient. That's a one-way street. Like, we're competing with that. The Europeans are doing their own thing. As much as we've benefited from globalization in the past, that's the world of industrial policy is not a world in which you're increasing globalization. And then you've got the risks associated with that. As you think about kind of the political environment in the next couple of years in the U.S., and if Trump were to come back, he's very clearly indicated, like, the one thing that he's been clear about, other than the collection of stolen, all the usual garbage, is he wants to put a 10% tariff on all U.S. imports. Right? So you're amping up the protectionism. And that's like the one economic thing he's come out with so far. Now, whether he does it or not, if he wins, we'll see. But that's economic war, right? So we are in a path where trading relationships are much more contentious, and they will be until something breaks, until we realize, listen, it's costing us so much more to produce all these things in the U.S. or wherever it is, and then we got to figure out a way of doing that.
So are we going to be insulated in some friend-shoring cocoon in which we are part of the nice people who get to trade together, or are we going to be out there on our own?
Yeah, it's difficult to see how that's not the case. Now, Trump might change everything, but if you think of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, and you overlay on top of that the green transition, and you overlay on top of that kind of the post-pandemic supply chain disruptions, it all goes into a world where you got to think about regional trading blocks a little more than you used to. So, for instance, the Americans, they want access to minerals, which we have plenty of, safe access to minerals. They need access to workers, which we're going to have a lot more of going forward, and the Mexicans as well. So our thesis is that as we go forward, you're more likely to see integration within North America at the expense of trading with other partners outside North America, because we are effectively self-sufficient, right? So you can kind of have a North American island or entire South America, the Western Hemisphere island, and that to me, based on how people think about supply chains, how they think about risk in their operations, how politicians down south think about that, it seems like that's the direction we're going in. So yeah, probably a much tighter North American economy.
Right. Feels like we went through a long period of time where trade considerations drove foreign policy, and now it feels like sovereignty considerations are driving foreign policy, and that's going to have impacts on trade.
No choice, right? I mean, if part of the concern of trade policymakers or politicians is, I want to protect my economy against, some rogue state invading another, 100% that leaves you in the space of, okay, I'm willing to pay a little bit more to produce stuff, say North America, because I'm not afraid of having to put sanctions on Canada 2 years from now because they will have invaded Iceland or something.
Right. Okay, can we wrap up on a few topical notes?
We can.
So we talked about interest rates earlier. When do you think interest rates will start to decline? And what will the new normal be? I presume they don't go back down to zero.
If they go back down to zero, it's because we got a problem.
Right.
Listen, we still have an inflation problem in Canada. Inflation accelerated last month. It's an unfortunate surprise. The economy is still reasonably strong. We created 40,000 jobs in August. Decline in jobs in Ontario, but whatever, national 40,000. If anything, in the short run, interest is likely to go up further. Whether it's 25 basis points, 50 basis points remains to be seen. But the damage that the bank has been trying to engineer is just not important enough yet for them to be off the rate tightening path. But it's virtually impossible that we find ourselves in a situation where, say, the middle of next year, we're not in some form of a rate cutting scenario. Then the question becomes, okay, well, whatever, is the second quarter, third quarter, somewhat inconsequential. More important is how fast those rates come down and where do they go down to.
Does that mean you think inflation will be at 2% by next year?
We think inflation is at 2% in 2025. So 2 years from now.
Right.
But that's a reflection of, one of the challenges in this kind of space is it takes a long time between which interest rates are moved and the full impact on it. It's like a 18 to 24 month process. So the fact that you're doing stuff now, you've done stuff over the last few months, that's going to pay off in the inflation space next year and into 2025. But to your point about where do rates land, like we're not in this world of kind of the pre-pandemic, post-financial crisis world of inflation's too low and central banks have got to keep rates really low to bring inflation up to 2. We're kind of coming at it from the other side. And then it's a matter of, what you assess, what the Bank of Canada would say is the neutral rate of interest. So like what's the normal rate of interest for an economy? Like everything is working fine, inflation's at 2, the economy is at equilibrium, nobody's, job shortages are fine. That rate is probably in the 2 to 3% range. So whatever, operationally we use 2.5, means 2025, 2026, which of course this isn't going to happen because it's 3 years down the road, something's going to screw up. But if everything works out, then the normal rate you should expect is, we'll say 2.5 from the Bank of Canada. And then whatever prime is over 2% above that, and mortgage rates reflecting that as well. So we're not in a world where people get 2% mortgages 2 years from now. We're not in a world where you're going to borrow for free, basically. Again, unless we have this major catastrophe and the central bank has to come back in and say, listen, inflation is now 0, and we got to crank it back up.
So this is probably just a personal thing for me, but I do think about it, even though it's not a personal thing, Christ, but I do think about it. So interest rates were low for long, and people assumed they would continue to be low, so there was no risk in getting a variable mortgage rate for your house.
Yep.
Right? So people took the lower variable rate rather than the slightly higher fixed rate because variable seemed as certain as fixed. Suddenly that changes. Right? Your bank, people's premiums go, people's monthly payments go
Right
up.
Yep.
Right, immediately. Every other bank doesn't do that. Every other bank says your payment stays the same, your amortization changes. Yep. So now you have a bunch of people who are not making any payment on their principal, may or may not be covering the interest. Yep. OSFI says that when that mortgage is renewed, it has to...
That's a reset at the original.
Absolutely.
Normal,
so are you expecting some housing renewal crisis in 2 or 3 years?
No, for a few reasons. One is, so we have the advantage of having a book where, as you point out, a lot of our clients have payments that are reset instantly, right? Sometimes by 100 basis points at a time, like massive shocks. When we look at, say, the default activity on those versus fixed rate mortgages, it's higher, but it's not meaningfully higher, right? It's still below where it was pre-pandemic. So folks have been able to absorb a large interest rate increase.
But the other banks haven't made them absorb that.
No. So I say this because, if there's kind of a lesson to be learned from the way that part of our book has operated, is when other banks turn around and normalize things, folks are able to withstand a pretty significant payment shock by and large. That being said,
Stress test is smart, right? I know that wasn't always the view, but admit it. Stress test was smart.
You got to give it to them. But the more important issue is, you can scare yourself silly into saying, hey, there are whatever 60 billion mortgages coming due next year, and people are going to reset at 2% interest rates, and payments are going to go up dramatically. That's true if people don't change their mortgage, right? The reality is almost everybody whose mortgages are going to renew this year, or next year, the year after that, are going to renew with much higher equity than they did when they took the loan.
Yeah.
So they're going to be able to say, listen, I'm paying 5% now instead of 3 or 2. I want to keep my payments reasonably fixed, so I'm going to extend my amortizations. I've got the equity in my house to be able to do that. So you can have a nightmare scenario where, say, assume nobody does that and everybody's payments increase dramatically. The reality is when mortgages come up, we know folks are going to go back and say, okay, well, you know what, add on a couple of years my mortgage, or 5 years. I got the equity for it, and that's, we think this is going to happen. So don't think there's going to be a kind of a massive payment shock to Canadians over the next couple of years. But that only works if house prices remain reasonably elevated or they keep going up. And in the environment they're in, as the mayor indicated, as you all know, like the supply-demand imbalance in Toronto or other parts of the country is so large that it's virtually inconceivable to think of an environment where you could get a significant adjustment in house prices to the downside. It's much easier to think that actually the affordability problem gets a lot worse than better in the next 10 years.
Right. Sticking with housing, you and your colleagues at Scotiabank produced a report on housing. Mm-hmm. It's pretty pessimistic about our ability to build the number of houses that need to get built to keep housing or get housing to an affordable place. I mean, I don't get this. Like, how is this logistical challenge beyond our wit to solve? Like, why can't we build houses?
That's a great question. A lot of it is because people didn't want houses to be built, right? So you've got kind of the regulatory, the approval process at the municipal level, provincial level, which favored NIMBYism to a very significant degree. Now that's changing, and it's changing pretty fast, but that's been definitely a huge hurdle, right? And it comes back to, listen, federal government decided we want 500,000 more people in the country, and then municipalities are like, well, or neighborhoods are like, well, I like the way my neighborhood is. I don't want a 3-unit apartment next to mine. I don't want more people on the roads. So that's been a very effective kind of blockage to development across the country. This is not a Toronto issue. Like, this is everywhere across the country. So that's the one thing. The other thing now is, even if we are in a world where it's clear the governments are seized by the idea that we need to expedite the construction of housing, the reality is that it's virtually impossible to do that, even if we were to free things up, because we are in a world where job shortages in the construction side are massive. Right? So it's not like you can ramp up production on the construction side, on the residential side very significantly, because you're just constrained from a labor perspective. It's like, there's 50% more vacancies in the Ontario construction industry now than there were pre-pandemic.
Wait a second. Why are there so many young men delivering pizzas and tacos in downtown Toronto and a shortage of construction workers?
That's a great question. The construction jobs are high paying, they're extremely valuable. It's for some reason, they're not appealing jobs to get into. So as you think about, and this is even more problematic, like I'm sounding super pessimistic now, but as you think about, say, the trade industry profile workers, they are retiring at a higher pace than anybody else because they're older. So something like 30% of construction workforce is going to retire, I forget if it's within 5 years or 10 years or something like that. And the replacement rate on those workers is horrible.
Right.
Because people aren't going into trades. It's not sexy. I don't know. I don't know why they aren't, but they're just not. So the challenge you have on the construction side is there kind of a real resource constraint is, okay, we want to build 1.5 million homes in Ontario. Where are we going to get the workers to do that?
Right.
We don't. We just don't have that. Now, maybe immigration changes those things, and over a number of years, we start bringing in more folks that are interested in trades or qualified trades, and that allows you to do that more rapidly. But that's not what's happening now.
Right. Okay. Last question is the most important question. Mm-hmm. Right. Are you as excited about the upcoming Toronto Maple Leaf season as everybody in this room is?
I'm a Raptors fan, not a. I'm not a hockey guy. I'm a basketball guy.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Habs, right?
Well, and I was raised in
Habs,
Montreal.
right?
I was raised in Montreal, and I have very fond memories of going to the Forum with my grandparents. So
Yeah. I have very fond memories of the 2021 playoffs. All right. I would like to thank Giles Gerson and the Toronto Regional Board of Trade for hosting us here today. I'd like to thank the Herle Burly presenting sponsor, TELUS, and sponsor CN Rail, everybody that watched or listened to this podcast, all of you in this room here today, and of course, especially you, Jean-François. Thank you for your time. Great, very interesting conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Herle Burly.